In the last videos, we've been talking about independent clauses, the problems with independent clauses, and the problems you can get when you don't even have an independent clause. Now we're going to unpack a little bit more the subordinate clause or the dependent clause. Now, as we said, the subordinate or dependent clause can't stand by itself. If it does, you have a fragment, so it can't stand by itself. It needs some sort of independent clause to finish the thought, or at least to finish the grammatical unit of thought. Now, what is a dependent clause? Well, I'm going to be very specific about what a subordinate or dependent clause is, because sometimes they're conflated with other things, and, that's okay. But in any event, first, a clause, remember, has a subject-verb relationship. Right? It has a finite verb. Subordinate means it is subordinated or dependent, if you use the other dependent clause term, dependent on something else. Now, let's take a sentence that would normally be an independent clause. I left the house. Independent clause, you got a subject, you got a verb, and that's fine as a standalone sentence. Now, what you can do to make it a dependent clause is add what's called a subordinating conjunction. Subordinating conjunction at the beginning of that clause to make it subordinate. So an example would be after. After I left the house, right, you can tell by the tone of my voice that we're waiting for something else and need something else to be complete. So this would be a subordinate clause. What else can we do with this sentence? Because I left the house would be another example. Once I left the house, though I left the house, when I left the house, and so on and so forth, right? Generally, these go as introductory modifiers, but they can also be put at the end of the sentence, right? The full sentence. So if I said, I drove my car, and then here's your subordinate clause, after I left the house. Now, even though it's at the end of the sentence, so after, I'll just say after I left. Even though it's the end of the sentence, it's still a subordinate clause, right? Because it's just a thing that, whether it's at the front or the beginning, or whether it's at the front or the end, it's still going to be subordinate to the main clause, the independent clause, I drove my car. So that is the main kind of subordinate clause. Note that it's always going to be marked off if it's at the beginning of the sentence with a comma. That's always the way it's going to be. And again, thinking back to the fragments video, if you don't have an independent clause to go with it, it becomes a fragment. So always watch out on the SAT to make sure that if you've got an introductory modifier that's a dependent clause, that you've marked it off properly with a comma, and that it has something, a finite verb, a independent clause to actually depend on later in the sentence. Now, so that is generally a subordinate or a dependent clause. There's not much more to say about that particular topic. Note that, I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but subordinate clauses can really fulfill multiple functions in a sentence. So they can act as adverbs, so they can tell you information about why an action is occurring or when an action is occurring. So actually here, after I left the house, I drove my car, for instance. I drove my car. This phrase, after or because, or we'll leave it as after, this phrase, or this clause, after I left the house, is an adverb modifying the drove. You don't really need to be able to recognize this, but maybe it will help you see what this is doing. So they can act as adverbs. They can act as adjectives. So an example, well, I won't give you an example, but they can act as adjectives, and they can act as nouns as well. And they can fulfill whatever roles nouns can. And there are, other things that these clauses can do. I won't go into the details, but basically just know that subordinate clauses can fulfill a lot of functions in a sentence, but the structure's got to be the same. You always got to have this subordinating conjunction, and then you've got to have your clause right here. All right. One thing I will mention is that there are other things that can go at the beginning of a sentence besides subordinate or dependent clauses. These are called generally introductory, that's right, modifiers. And what this means is these are things that modify something at the beginning of the sentence. Now you can have, as an example, prepositional phrases do this. And note that sometimes prepositions can also be subordinate conjunctions, in this case after. So after could also be a prepositional phrase, right? After the show, comma, we drove away. Right here, this is not a clause, there's no subject verb, but it is a prepositional phrase, and it is an introductory modifier. Whether or not you need the comma here, I've seen, some people say yes and people say no. In general, actually, we don't really need this if it's a prepositional phrase, unless the phrase is really long. But you're not going to be tested on that. I'm going to have a whole video on commas. In general, though, note they're never really going to test you on commas specifically. If a comma is wrong, it's because it follows some other rules, such as how you put together independent clauses, but they're not going to test you on comma use specifically. I know that's something that a lot of students obsess about, and commas are very confusing sometimes, but that's not something they're going to test specifically. I will have a video on that later, though. Some other introductory modifiers could be something like a participle phrase. And that would be something, again, I'll talk more about participles in another video. Or participial, I don't know, whatever. Participial phrase. I don't know why I can't say that. Having a tongue malfunction. Anyway, participle phrase, that would be something like running late after work. I blah. Right? This would be a participle phrase because you have running, which is a participle. We'll talk about that later. Running late after work. This is not actually a clause, doesn't have a subject-verb relationship, but it does modify this noun that comes after it. And when we talk about dangling modifiers and dangling participles, we'll actually talk about this a little bit more. Anyway, I won't go into too much detail here because really, all you really need to know for this is how to recognize the subordinate clause, how it functions in a sentence, how you need to punctuate it, and then be on the lookout for it on the test. Make sure there are no fragments. Make sure you always got that independent clause in your sentence.